Monsters don't sleep under your bed, they sleep inside your head. Creepiest Murders Part 1. The Acid Bath Murderer. John George Haigh was a murderer in the UK in the 1940s who thought he could avoid getting caught if there were no bodies, so he dissolved his victims in baths of acid. Unfortunately, there was still quite a bit of evidence to prove he killed 6 people, so he was executed. Though, he claimed to have killed 9 people in total. Haigh battered to death or shot his victims and disposed of their bodies using sulfuric acid before forging their signatures so he could sell their possessions and collect large sums of money. Today he is notoriously known as the Acid Bath Murderer. The Reinert Murders. In June 1979, Pennsylvania high school principal J.C. Smith murdered his co-worker, Susan Reinert. Her body was found weeks later in her car. Her kids went missing too, but their bodies were never found. Smith was believed to be conspiring with Reinert's boyfriend, William Bradfield, of the time to inherit Reinert's life insurance. J.C. Smith was convicted and sentenced to death in 1986 for the 1979 murder of Susan Reinert and her 2 children, Karen and Michael. He spent 6 years on Pennsylvania's death row until his conviction was overturned by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court due to prosecutorial misconduct. Strangely, Smith's daughter Stephanie Huntsberger, and her husband Edward Huntsberger, were reported missing in 1978 and never have been found.
I see you. I see you.
Elizabeth Bottery. Also known as the Blood Countess in the 1600s, Bottery is often referred to as the most prolific female serial killer of all time. The Hungarian countess purportedly tortured and murdered over 650 young women with the help of 4 other people, and would bathe in the blood of virgins to stay young. On December 30, 1609, Bottery and her servants were arrested. The servants were put on trial in 1611, and 3 were executed. Although never tried, Bottery was confined to her chambers at Castle Cashtas. She remained there until she died. Murder of Junko Furuta. In November 1988, 16-year-old Junko Furuta was kidnapped by 4 boys and held hostage in one of their homes in Tokyo. After beating, raping, and torturing her for 44 days, the boys tossed her lifeless body into a giant drum filled with concrete. Known throughout Japan as concrete, encased high school girl, the case of Junko Furuta drew nationwide attention owing to the sheer brutality the girl had to endure before death found her.
I see you.
The dark history behind the Lizzie Borden house. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. This macabre rhyme will be familiar to anyone who has grown up in the Massachusetts area. In 1892, Lizzie Borden of Fall River was tried and acquitted for the gory murders of her father and mother. Her guilt has long been debated, with many believing that she did indeed carry out the killings. Though, officially she was found to be not guilty. The Shoe Fetish Slayer. Jerry Brudos abducted, bludgeoned, and murdered 4 women. He claimed that women's shoes were his substitute for pornography, and used the severed foot of one of his victims to model shoes in his home. Police also found severed breasts being used as paperweights in his home. So sick. Jerry Bruto's love for shoes began at the age of 5 after he rescued a pair of high-heel shoes from the garbage. As he grew older, his unusual interest in shoes developed into a fetish which he satisfied by breaking into homes to steal shoes and women's underwear. Cleveland torso murders. Someone killed and dismembered at least 12 people in the 1930s, and the killer was never found. Body parts were scattered all over Cleveland, Ohio, the first parts found by kids playing in a field, and only 2 of the 12 victims were ever identified. Most victims came from an area east of Kingsbury Run called the Roaring Third, known for its bars, gambling dens and brothels. Another name for this area was Hobo Jungle, as it was home to many vagrants. Despite an investigation of the murders, which at one time was led by famed lawman Elliot Ness, then Cleveland's public safety director, the murderer was never apprehended. The Black Dahlia murder case. Elizabeth Short, more famously known as the Black Dahlia, was found murdered in Los Angeles, California, on January 15, 1947. Because of the grisly nature of her case, which included her corpse being mutilated and severed from the waist, it gained rapid national attention. The details surrounding Short's life are largely unknown, rather than she was an aspiring actress. The case is one commonly cited as being one of Los Angeles County's most infamous unsolved murders. The wood chipper murder. After learning of her husband's multiple affairs, Hal Nielsen went missing in November 1986. A snowplow driver later told police he'd seen Crafts's husband using a wood chipper recently in the woods, and human remains were soon found that confirmed that her body had been frozen and then put through the chipper. This case supposedly was an inspiration for the movie Fargo. The Butcher of Hanover. Fritz Harmon sexually assaulted, mutilated, dismembered, and murdered more than 24 boys between 1919 to 1924, in Germany. He was found guilty for the majority of the murders, and was sentenced to death by beheading in late 1924. In addition, in accordance with German practice, his honorary rights of citizenship were revoked. He was subsequently executed in April 1925. Harmon became known as the Butcher of Hanover due to the extensive mutilation and dismemberment committed upon his victims' bodies, and by such titles as the Vampire of Hanover and the Wolfman because of his preferred murder method of biting into or through his victims' throats. Belle Gunness. Brunhild Paulsdatter Storset, better known as Belle Gunness, is a Norwegian-American serial killer who would lure men to her farm, take out life insurance policies on them, or have them bring a bunch of money so they could invest in her growing property, kill them, then feed them to her pigs. She also killed most of her boyfriends, her 2 husbands, and both of her daughters. She was also known as Hell's Belle, the Black Widow, and Lady Bluebeard because of her infamous reputation as a murderer with an affinity for killing men who were romantically attracted to her. The exact number of men she killed is unknown, estimated to be between 14 and 40 victims, but one thing is for sure: men and sadly children that crossed her path were always in danger of being her next victim. The Hinterkaifeck murders. In 1922, the gruesome murder of a family that took lives of 6 people occurred in Hinterkaifeck, a small farm 70 kilometers north of Munich, Germany. Few days prior to the murder, Homeowner Andreas Gruber noticed some footprints from the forest in the snow leading into the back of the family home, but none leading out. Since then, they heard strange footsteps in the attic and discovered a newspaper they never bought. It prompted their maid to leave the house in a hurry. On the day of the murder, a new maid arrived, and along with the family, she was also killed by someone using a pickaxe. The killer was never caught despite the large-scale investigation. The murder of Karina Holmer. A 20-year-old Swedish au pair disappeared outside a Boston nightclub at 3 a.m. on June 23, 1996. Later that day, her upper body was found in a dumpster. The murder has never been solved, and the killer and the motive for her killing remain unknown, as are the whereabouts of the lower half of her body.
Help me. Help me.
Dean Corll, the Candyman. Dean Arnold Corll was an American serial killer who abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 29 teenage boys and young men between 1970 and 1973 in Houston, Texas. He used two teen accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley, to lure boys to his house with promises of a party or a ride home. The crimes, which became known as the Houston mass murders, came to light after his accomplice Wayne Henley eventually had enough with it, and fatally shot Corll. Upon discovery, it was considered the worst example of serial murder in U.S. history. The Brides in the Bath Murders. George Joseph Smith was an English serial killer and bigamist. In the 1910s, George would find a nice rich lady to marry, make sure she had life insurance that named him as the beneficiary, and then they mysteriously all die in bathtubs. The case becomes known as the Brides in the Bath Murders. George was suspected of having murdered 3 of his wives, but due to laws of the time, was only convicted of 1. Being widely reported in the media, the case was significant in the history of forensic pathology and detection. It was also one of the first cases in which similarities between connected crimes were used to prove deliberation, a technique used in subsequent prosecutions.